Welcome to our deep dive today. We've got some interesting articles, about this heated debate going on over in the UK.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about changes to the state pension age and specifically how it's impacting millions of women.
Right. It's a complex issue.
It is.
There's a lot of strong arguments on both sides.
Definitely.
So,
We're here to break it down.
yeah, help you navigate through it, help you understand.
So,
I mean, at its core, it's kind of like this, this classic clash between like what people expect and
right.
the reality of, how demographics are changing and how long-term policies have to adapt to that.
Yeah, so the heart of this whole thing is that we have 3.6 million women
Yeah,
born in the 1950s
right.
who are saying they weren't really given the heads up,
Yeah,
about the government raising their state pension age to match men's.
to be the same, yeah.
Right. And this has, predictably caused a lot of controversy.
Of course, yeah.
With some arguing that these women deserve, some kind of compensation. While the government is saying, look, these changes were announced, everybody knew, and plus, we kind of needed to do this financially.
Right. For sustainability reasons.
Right.
I think, to understand this a bit better, it helps to look back a little.
Yeah, give us that context.
So, for years, the state pension age in the UK was different for men and women.
Yeah.
65 for men, 60 for women.
Mm-hmm.
And as people started living longer, the government, saw this coming.
Yeah, it makes sense.
They started planning to even those ages out.
And that's where we get the 1995 Pensions Act, right?
You got it, exactly. So that act laid out this plan to gradually raise the pension age for women to 65. And the idea was to start that in 2010.
Okay.
But then things got a little complicated.
Oh, rich in the plans.
You could say that.
Yeah.
So in 2010, you had this new coalition government,
Great.
and they decided to speed things up.
So basically, the 2011 Pensions Act came in and said, nope, we're accelerating this timeline.
Exactly. They moved that target date for women to hit 65 up to 2018.
Oh, wow.
And, that's really at the heart of all the complaints we're seeing now.
Yeah, I can see why. You plan your whole life around retiring at a certain age, and then suddenly it's pushed back.
Albie.
Years.
Yeah.
That would be frustrating.
Oh, yeah. Imagine having to completely, rethink your whole financial plan just like that. There's this group, the Women Against State Pension Inequality.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, WASPI. And they've been very vocal.
Yeah.
About how they feel about this whole thing.
Yeah.
Their argument is that they weren't given enough notice.
Right.
Hey, this is happening. Get ready, So it made it really difficult for them to plan. How are you supposed to adjust your finances?
Yeah, makes sense.
And some women are saying, well, I might have worked longer. I had to work longer than I thought I would because of this.
Right. So all of this leads to this investigation, right?
Yeah.
By the Parliamentary Ombudsman.
Yeah.
And for our listeners who, might not be familiar, the Ombudsman, it's like an independent body.
Yeah.
They investigate complaints against the government.
Yeah.
So like a neutral party.
Yeah, exactly.
So what do they find?
Well, they came to the conclusion that the government didn't do a good enough job communicating these changes.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they actually recommended that the government pay compensation.
Wow.
Between £1,000 and £2,950 per woman.
Oh, that's significant.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Okay, so big recommendation for the government to consider. So what was their response?
Well, they ended up rejecting it.
So they said no to the compensation.
Yeah. Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary at the time, she argued that people already knew about these changes.
Okay.
There was considerable awareness, she said.
Mm-hmm.
And she also argued that even if they had sent letters out earlier, it wouldn't have made that much of a difference.
Okay, so they're saying even if there were communication problems, it didn't really cause any financial harm.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it, I guess.
Okay.
And they also brought up the cost,
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
They were worried about how much it would cost to compensate all these women.
Right.
They said it could be as much as $10.5 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, and they said, well, that's not really fair to put that burden on taxpayers.
Okay, so I'm guessing the WASPI women were not thrilled about that.
Yeah, they were very critical of that decision. They called it an insult.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And they also kind of, said, well, what's the point of having the ombudsman if you're just going to ignore them?
Right, if you're not going to take their advice seriously.
Yeah.
Okay.
Angela Madden, she's the chair of WASPI.
Okay.
And she criticized the government, saying they were basically just ignoring this independent watchdog.
Right. It does sound like one of those classic political standoffs.
Yeah.
Where, there are valid points on both sides.
Yeah.
You've got the government they have to think about the money.
Right.
And, people are living longer these days, so social programs are getting more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side, you have, thousands of real people
Yeah, real people.
who feel like they were given a bad deal.
Yeah, like they've had to make tough choices.
Right. And they're struggling financially, emotionally.
Right. It's not just about the money either. It's about how this has affected their lives.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's not just numbers. It's people's lives being upended.
exactly. And that brings up this idea of transitional justice.
Okay.
Like, how do societies deal with, things that maybe weren't fair in the past, especially when you're trying to balance, what's right for individuals versus, like, the bigger goals of society.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Going through these articles, the stories that really stood out to me were from the women who were talking about, the financial hardship.
Yeah.
They're in debt, having to delay retirement.
Right.
I mean, emotional distress.
Yeah.
It's real. Were there any particular stories that struck you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you read about people having to dip into their savings just to make ends meet.
Yeah, and it's thinking about the whole issue of, like, how the government communicates these kinds of things.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Because one of the main arguments from WASPI is, hey, we didn't know this was happening.
Right.
No one told us.
Mm.
So if we zoom out a bit, how crucial is it for the government to be really clear,
Yeah.
especially with policies that impact people's money?
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely vital.
Yeah.
It's critical because when people are caught off guard by these big changes,
Right.
it really erodes their trust
Yeah.
in the whole system.
It's almost like, when you're training for a marathon
Yeah.
and someone moves the finish line.
Oh, yeah, that's a good analogy. Suddenly you're running further than you thought.
Yeah, and you're like, what the heck?
Yeah, it's not fair.
You feel betrayed. Exactly.
And in this case, the ombudsman actually did say, look, the government didn't do a good enough job communicating.
Right, they confirmed that, yeah.
Yeah.
Their investigation showed that, sure, there were some attempts to inform people, but, they didn't really make sure that everyone who was going to be affected actually understood what was going on.
Right. It makes you think, was this a factor, how people get information these days?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Back then, like the 90s, early 2000s,
Sure.
internet wasn't as big.
Right, not as widespread.
People got their news differently.
Yeah, newspapers, TV.
Right. So maybe some of these communication attempts, they just, I don't know, missed the mark.
Yeah, maybe. It's a different world now.
It is.
I mean, look, things have changed so much. The government really needs to keep up,
Yeah.
to make sure their messages are actually getting through. They can't just rely on putting something in a government publication
Right.
or just doing a TV announcement.
Or hoping people read the newspaper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, social media, online platforms, all that.
Right. That's how people are getting their news these days.
Exactly. And, this kind of takes us back to something we've been talking about, this tension between what individuals want, what they need,
Yeah.
and what the government has to do.
I want that balance.
Yeah. Let's dig into that a little more. So on the one hand, people have a right to expect that the government is going to be fair,
Right.
that things are transparent. I mean, they rely on the government for all kinds of things.
Yeah. Essential services, making sure things are just, socially just.
Right. But the government also have to think about managing resources,
Yeah.
making decisions that are good for the whole country,
Okay.
even if, those decisions are tough. And maybe not everyone's happy.
So basically, the government is trying to walk this tightrope
Yeah.
between what's good for the individual and what's good for everyone.
Yeah. And that's where it gets tricky.
I mean, so in this whole pension situation, the government basically said, look, we hear you.
Yeah.
We get it.
Yeah.
But we have to think about the money.
Right.
Mm-hmm. We can't just spend without thinking about the consequences.
Right. The taxpayers.
Yeah.
So they're kind of between a rock and a hard place.
I think so. They know there's an issue, but they're saying, look, fixing it this way, it's going to cost way too much.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to that idea of transitional justice.
Yeah.
How do you fix what was wrong in the past, acknowledge that people were hurt,
Yeah.
but also be realistic about what the government can actually do, what's possible?
Right. It's a really tough question.
It is. It's a big one.
And this whole WASPI case, I mean, it really brings up those questions
It does.
about what the government should be doing, especially when it comes to people's financial security later in life.
Yeah. And how do you balance that, what individuals need versus what's good for the whole country when you don't have unlimited money.
Yeah, it's something that countries around the world are dealing with.
Oh, yeah. This isn't just a UK thing.
It's a global thing.
It is. But, okay, let's focus back on the WASPy women.
Okay.
So the government said no to compensation.
Right.
Did the campaign, did it just kind of fizzle out?
Yeah, good question.
Actually, no, not at all. It kind of went the opposite way.
Really?
Yeah, it gained even more momentum.
Wow.
Yeah, they got support from all over the political spectrum.
So they really managed to turn up the volume even though the government was saying no.
Exactly. It's really a good example of how grassroots activism can, really make an impact.
Okay.
I mean, the government still didn't budge on the compensation thing.
Right.
But the WASPy campaign, they really raised awareness.
Yeah.
And they pushed the people in charge to, at least look at other ways to fix things.
Okay, so it sounds like they realized they might not get everything they wanted, but they shifted their focus to finding, other ways to address the problem.
You got it. They started looking at different things they could push for.
Yeah.
Like targeted financial support.
Okay.
For the women who were really hit the hardest.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they also advocated for better job training programs.
Right.
To help women get back into the workforce if they needed to.
Okay, so almost like a more practical approach.
Yeah, exactly.
They realized that to get things done in politics, you have to be flexible.
Yeah. Compromise is key.
And this is where, I'm guessing, the opposition parties saw an opening, right?
Absolutely. They jumped on this.
To kind of highlight how the government was handling things.
Yeah, exactly. The WASPy campaign had support from both sides of the political aisle.
Wow.
Which put a lot of pressure on the government.
Okay.
To do something.
So this whole issue became kind of a political football.
Yeah, you could say that, but I think in the end, it actually helped the WASPy women.
Huh.
Well, it forced everyone to really talk about this, in a serious way,
Right.
about what the government's role is
Yeah.
when it comes to making sure people have financial security later in life.
Right. And how do you make that fair for everyone?
Exactly. And eventually, the government did make some concessions.
Okay, so they offered something. Did they end up doing the financial compensation?
Well, not full compensation.
Yeah.
Not like what WASPy was asking for originally.
Right.
But they did introduce some things to try to help.
Okay, so a partial victory. What did they do specifically?
Well, one thing was they put in this transitional arrangement
Okay.
to help women who were close to retirement age,
Mm-hmm.
but who hadn't had enough time to adjust, their savings and stuff.
Okay.
And this arrangement, it basically offered a little bit of money, like a temporary payment, to help them out until they reach their new pension age.
So like a bridge until they could get their full pension.
Yeah, exactly.
Did they do anything else?
Yeah, they also started some programs to help women with job training and retraining.
Okay.
The idea was to give them some skills so they could find work, if they had to delay retirement.
So basically helping them stay in the workforce longer if they needed to.
Yeah, to make up for that lost pension income.
I can see how some women would be grateful for that.
Oh, absolutely.
But, others probably not so happy about having to work longer.
Right. It's a mixed bag, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, some people saw it as a lifeline.
Yeah.
Others felt like the government was just putting the responsibility back on them.
Right. You figure it out.
Yeah, instead of actually fixing the problem.
But hey, at least the government did something.
Yeah, they felt the pressure, that's for sure.
From the WASPy campaign and from the public.
Exactly.
So ultimately, even though they didn't get everything they wanted, the WASPy women did have a real impact.
Yeah, they made a difference. They held the government accountable.
Yeah.
They forced them to try to make things a little bit better.
Exactly. Yeah. So even though it's a complex issue, I hope our listeners are walking away with, a better understanding of it all.
Me too.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the, the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
Well, first of all, this is a really complicated issue.
Yeah.
There's no easy answers.
Right.
And finding solutions, you have to listen to everyone
Mm-hmm.
and weigh the different interests.
Not just about the money, it's about how these decisions affect people's lives.
Exactly.
Their plans, their
Yeah.
dreams.
Yeah. It's about fairness.
Right.
And, we need to be willing to have these tough conversations.
Open and honest.
Yeah. And really try to find solutions that work for everyone.
And that will last.
Yeah.
And I think that's a key point. This isn't like a one and done thing.
Right.
This is an ongoing conversation. How do we make sure everyone has a secure retirement?
Yeah, good question.
We all need to be part of that conversation.
I agree. It's a tough one. But it's an important one.
It is.
And by working together, I think we can figure it out.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We encourage everyone to keep learning about this.
Yeah, stay informed.
Stay engaged.
Keep the conversation going.
And help shape a better future for everyone, for all generations.
Absolutely.